I think we'll get started with introductions here. I want to be respectful of your time over the noon hour here. So I just want to welcome you all to this webinar today entitling Protecting Iowa's Wetlands, the Case for Swampbuster. I'm Colleen Fowle. I'm the Water Program Director for the Iowa Environmental Council, and thank you for attending today. We're going to be using the Q&A feature, so if you have questions during the webinar today, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions for our speakers. Before we get into the speakers today, I want to give you a quick background information on Iowa Environmental Council. If you're just joining our webinar here for the first time today. So the Iowa Environmental Council is a statewide nonprofit organization, and we're in our 30th year this year. We are the largest environmental coalition in the state of Iowa, and our work is informed by science and data and the stories of Iowans. So sometimes we educate, sometimes we lead, other times we learn and follow, but really, we're really a coalition building organization. We strive to be inclusive and nonpartisan. And like I mentioned before, we really are trying to build a coalition and listen to others and their expertise. And all with our mission in mind that we are working towards a just, healthy environment and a sustainable future for all Iowans. So today we have two speakers with us who are going to talk about the Swampbuster case and the ruling that recently was released. Our first speaker is going to be Mike Schmidt. He's the general counsel for the Iowa Environmental Council, and he's focusing on law and policy in each of IEC's three areas, which are water, climate, and energy. Mike has a law degree from the University of Minnesota and a BA in political science from the University of Iowa. He previously worked for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy before coming to the Iowa Environmental Council in 2019. Our second speaker today will be John Gilbert. John farms with family members on the eastern edge of the Des Moines Lobe between Iowa Falls and Hubbard. John raises crops, dairy and beef cattle and pigs, which have been sold to the Neiman Ranch since 1998. The home dairy farm has been in the Gilbert family for almost 130 years. Both Practical Farmers of Iowa and Neiman Ranch have recognized the farm for its work in sustainability, and John has served on the boards of the Hardin County Soil and Water Conservation District, the South Fork Watershed Alliance, and the Iowa Farmers Union. John was one of the farmers making a declaration as part of the Swampbuster lawsuit, so we're really happy he's able to join us today. With that, I will turn it over to Mike to give you a little bit of background on Swampbuster. Take it away, Mike.
Thank you very much, Colleen. I'm very excited to talk about wetlands in Iowa and why this case will have a big impact on water quality, flooding, and agriculture. Before I get into the details, I want to provide a little bit of context. Swampbuster is a voluntary wetland conservation program that Congress authorized in 1985 as part of the federal Farm Bill. And at that time, Congress called wetlands a, quote, priceless resource. And Congress declared that the loss of more than 50% of the nation's wetlands at that point in time was, quote, environmentally unacceptable. Because of that, Congress decided to condition farm subsidies, which are important for a lot of farmers around the country. Congress said to be eligible for those subsidies, you cannot plant commodity crops in designated wetlands. You can use those wetlands for other things. So if you wanted to build a house or even a subdivision, Swampbuster doesn't stop you. There might be other regulations about that might stop you, but Swampbuster does not apply. At the time, back in 1985, agricultural conversion dominated the loss of wetlands. And after Swampbuster was adopted in 1985, agricultural uses became a small fraction of wetland losses across the country. As any Iowan can tell you, the setting here is very different from the Iowa that existed a couple hundred years ago. The landscape today does not look like it used to. Iowa has about 36 million acres, and historically, a lot of that was in prairie and woodlands. It might be a little bit hard to see on this map, but in especially north central Iowa, there are a lot of tiny blue dots, and those were wetlands. In the last couple hundred years, what we've seen is that we have converted a lot of those wetlands to farmland. We've converted prairies to farmland. We've drained about 95% of the wetlands in the state. And in north central Iowa, that percentage is even higher. It's more like 98 or 99% of wetlands. So today, out of Iowa's 36 million acres, about 25 million are in agricultural uses. To do all that wetland drainage, we required a lot of plumbing, basically. This is called tile drainage, which is plumbing for farm fields to lower water levels in the field. This can have an effect on flooding, although that effect depends on where in the watershed the tile drainage is and whether you have any control measures in place. It also means that in some cases you can have preferential flow paths. So if you have cracks in the soil or macropores, things like earthworm burrows, things on the surface of the soil can get down to the tile drain very quickly. That could mean fertilizer or manure or other things can very quickly get from the soil into surface water. The scope of tile drainage in Iowa is significant, to say the least. We have some counties in Iowa where more than 70% of the county is tile drained. And this percentage by county is not the percent of the row crop land or even the percentage of total agricultural land. It is the total land in the county. So even counting the cities and towns and roads, in some counties, more than 70% of the area is tile drained. Perhaps not surprisingly, given these percentages, Iowa has the most tile drainage nationwide. We have nearly a quarter of the tile drainage in the country here in Iowa. And in terms of acres, it's about 13 million acres. I mentioned earlier, we have about 25 million acres in agricultural uses. So the majority of it is tile drained. Because of all that tile drainage, we've lost a lot of wetlands. Iowa has been investing significant taxpayer money in restoring or creating wetlands for water quality benefits and flood control, erosion prevention. So there are numerous efforts to increase our wetlands. People recognize that they have a range of values and we need to be protecting them. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also protects wetlands for wildlife habitat. We've seen drops in aquifer levels due to increased withdrawals because we're losing some of the groundwater recharge that wetlands can provide as well. Another piece of context for all this is the Farm Bill subsidies and support for commodity production and conservation programs. At a high level, the economics of cropping decisions are really driven by the federal Farm Bill. Subsidy payments distort what crops are grown and where they are grown, and commodity program subsidies are historically the largest share of the federal Farm Bill funding. So the brown section of the pie chart here is historically the commodity program subsidies from 1995 to 2023. More recently, crop insurance has been the dominant chunk. So in 2023, 50% of subsidies were for crop insurance. And the federal government pays the majority of the crop insurance premiums, which reduces the risk for farmers of bad weather or some other outcome that prevents them from getting a good harvest. That encourages growing on land that might not be optimal for crop production, including potentially wetlands. At the same time, we have conservation program funding that in some ways is trying to offset these other slices of the pie, things like the Conservation Reserve Program, set aside land so that it is not cropped for a period of time. while with the other chunks of this, we are kind of encouraging more crop production. Given the size of those federal payments, Iowa gets $1 billion a year. Some people think that it's worth having a bigger argument about who gets those payments and the conditions on them. That brings us to CTM Holdings LLC versus the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the case that was decided last month. CTM Holdings is a land holding company, an LLC, with one primary operator, and it bought land in 2022 in Northeast Iowa. The land had wetlands near the formation of a creek in Delaware County in Northeast Iowa, and the landowner thought that the wetlands didn't have standing water, weren't wetlands, and he should not be restricted from farming around or on those wetland areas. So CTM Holdings sued the U.S. Department of Agriculture and argued that the actual conditions of Swampbuster were unconstitutional. It also argued that the USDA rules around defining where the wetlands are and how to challenge that process were beyond the agency's statutory authority. That suit was filed in April of last year, and we moved to intervene with Iowa Farmers Union, Food and Water Watch, and Dakota Rural Action, which was granted in December of last year. The next month, all the parties in the case filed cross motions for summary judgment, which means each party said, this has legal issues that a judge can decide. It's not an issue for a jury to decide, because a jury decides facts, and the issues here are more legal, whether Swampbuster is valid, whether the USDA rules are valid. By arguing that the conditions of Swampbuster were unconstitutional, a victory for the plaintiff would essentially overturn Swampbuster across the country, finding that Swampbuster is not a valid exercise of Congress's power. This is not the only time or the only way that Congress conditions money. For example, there's a parallel program for highly erodible land called Sodbuster. Like Swampbuster, Sodbuster is credited with being very effective because it says to be eligible for those same subsidies as Swampbuster, you have to have a conservation program or plan for highly erodible land. So it's credited with reducing soil loss very significantly across the country. Congress also puts conditions on lots of other spending. So a decision in this case could have much broader implications. It could essentially turn farm subsidies and maybe other congressional spending into entitlement programs of taxpayer money. If the case is not successful, we essentially keep the status quo. We've had Swampbuster in place for 40 years. Farmers have been operating with Swampbuster for the last 40 years. And so if the case doesn't proceed, then people continue operating the way that they have. One of the first questions in a court case is whether the plaintiff who's bringing the case has standing. That's a question of whether someone has a case for a court to decide at all. The legal standard for that is that the plaintiff has been harmed, the harm is caused by the defendant, and the court can fix that harm. If those are not in place, then there's no reason for the court to participate at all or to do anything at all. The plaintiff here argued that USDA could not condition subsidies on the land shown in this picture. The area with the standing trees was designated wetland, and there were some other forested areas that were not designated wetlands, and so the plaintiff cut down those trees while leaving the trees in the areas designated as wetlands. So with this limited wetland area, a few things could show that the plaintiff was harmed. One is economic harm. So if the plaintiff was losing money or losing farm benefits or losing the use of land, then in terms of the causation, is the defendant causing this? The question's kind of, did USDA deny a request to remove the wetland designation so that the plaintiff is unjustly stuck with this wetland that they can't farm? Is it a final action by the agency that the plaintiff has to follow? And is there clarity that the plaintiff will be harmed? The court basically said no to all of these. The plaintiff knew about the wetland. The plaintiff can still use the land. They can use it for other purposes. They just can't use it for commodity crops while also getting the subsidies under the Farm Bill. They also did not very clearly make a request to USDA to reevaluate the wetland designation. And in the response letters to the plaintiff, USDA said, if you would like to would like to request a reevaluation, a redetermination, please provide the basis for that. And if the plaintiff had done so, maybe USDA would have responded differently. So any harm is ultimately speculative. The court went on to evaluate the claims under the constitutional questions that the plaintiff raised. The first was about the Commerce Clause. The plaintiff claimed that the Commerce Clause does not allow for Swampbuster to be valid. The Commerce Clause is the basis for the Clean Water Act because navigable waters allow commercial transport between states. So there's an interstate interest, a federal interest. Another question is whether the limitations imposed by Swampbuster constitute a taking of private land. And if the government takes land from private landowners, they must compensate for that loss. The plaintiff argued that Swampbuster so restricted the use of the land that it amounted to a taking, even if the plaintiff still owned the wetlands. But of course, the plaintiff is still free to grow crops and not get subsidies, or use the land for other things and still get the subsidies. And one other legal question or constitutional question is whether the spending clause applies. And Congress, as part of the balance of powers across our three branches of government, has the power of the purse to decide how taxes are spent. Congress regularly puts restrictions on how money is spent. And ultimately, the judge in this case found that Swampbuster is valid under the spending clause. Congress is conditioning how it spends money. And if it's valid under the spending clause, it doesn't have to be valid under something else. You know, if freedom of speech is protected under the First Amendment, you don't have to have it protected under some other amendment or every other section of the Constitution at the same time. It's valid under one, and that is sufficient. So in terms of the Commerce Clause, the judge said, in resisting summary judgment, the plaintiff essentially gives up its arguments on this issue. On the question of a taking, the judge said, plaintiff's argument does not fit. Plaintiff can still use the land. And then, is it valid under the spending clause? The judge pretty simply said, yes, it is. The last kind of legal question or set of questions was about the rules that the U.S. Department of Agriculture has to implement Swampbuster. Part of this is about how to request a reevaluation of what wetlands are, and part of it is about what constitutes converting a wetland into cropland. The statute says USDA can only visit wetland determinations or reevaluate wetland determinations if asked by the affected person. It doesn't define what that process is. It doesn't say how USDA evaluates the requests. It's sort of a typical high-level statute with gaps that the agency needs to fill in. USDA's approach was to say, you need some evidence of a change or a mistake by NRCS to request a different outcome. If circumstances are the same, there's no reason for USDA to go back and redo an evaluation of wetlands. The plaintiff's position seems to be that USDA can't make any rules to interpret the law, even if the law has some gaps. The other rule at issue is about what a converted wetland is, converting it to cropland. And USDA adopted a rule and included an example. It said if you remove woody vegetation, then that can be converting the wetland. It might change the hydrology of the wetland. It also means it would be easier to plant a crop there. So USDA said that's enough to be a conversion if you are essentially changing what's growing in that location. So in looking at this, the judge evaluated the plaintiff's arguments and found the process that USDA set up did not exceed the statute. USDA needs some way to actually process requests, and the statute didn't really provide one. In terms of the woody vegetation removal as a way of converting wetlands, the judge said that's just an example. It's not changing the meaning. It's just saying if you change the wetland, maybe it's a conversion. The result of all this is that the plaintiff did not have a basis to bring the case at all. Swampbuster was also found valid under the spending clause, and the USDA rules implementing Swampbuster are valid. As a result of all that, wetlands continue to be protected by Swampbuster, and the parallel program Sodbuster still protects highly erodible land, and there's not a big shift in how agriculture works. After the decision came out, there was some news coverage that the plaintiff plans to appeal this case. So that appeal would go to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. And if they appeal a decision there, that would go to the US Supreme Court. So we are waiting to see what happens with that. The plaintiff has 60 days to appeal the decision in the case. And with that, I will turn it over to John Gilbert to talk about the value of farm wetlands.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to start by, thanking the Iowa Environmental Council for organizing this and for, inviting me to participate. It's always, one thing I'm willing to do is talk about our farm. We were able to participate in this lawsuit because, we've had experiences, with basically swampland, I guess, wetlands, is the better term. But the long and short of it is, we consider it to be an important it's something we need lots of on our landscape, and I guess if through my comments, I would hope you can all take away, two things. The first is, there's a lot of talk about rights, and there's way too little focus on responsibilities, because every right comes with a responsibility. And the greater the right or the privilege, the more profound the responsibility. And I feel very strongly that it's a precious few of us that ever have the privilege of being caretakers for a little corner of creation, and that's really why the responsibility that comes with that privilege is quite profound. The second thing I hope you'll take away is that not every farm has a place for a wetland, but every farm that does have a place for a wetland really should have one developed. There are some programs available that can help with those, and if we get a chance toward the end, I'll point toward those a little bit. Just a little introduction of our farm. We farm with my wife and I farm with our eldest son John and his wife Sarah and their two girls, and we also farm with one of my five brothers, Greg, and his wife Barb, and altogether the farm is just short of 800 deeded acres. It's one of those situations where it's, farmed together but separately. So, you know, we have basically two farm, businesses that run in parallel or and synchronized. The one that, is primarily done by, you know, my wife Beverly and I and our son John and Sarah is, um, it is based a lot on livestock. You know, it's basically it's a livestock operation. And from the core, of this farm, going back to when, you know, my late father returned, after service in the Navy during the war, it's been a dairy farm. And, it's varied a little from time to time on just how that, you know, how the dairying has, you know, has been handled, but we've been basically a dairy farm. You know, I tend to, approach farming as, you know, with the belief and understanding that the primary function of a farmer is to care for the land. Um, it's not about what you produce. It's not about how much you produce. It's about, you know, how good a job you do taking care of the land. And I've always understood that, you know, if you take care of the land will take care of you. And so that has been our approach. And, a lot of our landscape, says it needs animals. And so that's why we're primarily, you know, um, based on livestock. The crops we raise, first and foremost are to feed our animals. If we have some left over, you know, then those are sold. Um, we've never switched to, traded crops. Everything we raise is, you know, is represented to us as being, you know, traditionally bred or non-traded. And that was the decision we made based on, the needs of our animals and, um, preferences of our animals. They can tell the difference. And so if we're in the business of, you know, selling meat, meat and milk, we've figured it should have, you know, shouldn't have things in it that the animals don't want to eat. Um, what we're looking at in the slide here is the, south part of the farm. There's another, two tracks or another 320 acres, about a quarter mile north of this. That includes the dairy farm where I grew up and, you know, some other land that, is all pretty typical, prairie pothole, swales and hummocks and low spots and potholes and, as the slide showed, it's, you know, it's all tiled. You know, that's the only way, you know, we, can farm a lot of this land. And unfortunately, we've also got about a geographic mile of the South Fork. And South Fork is, really, it's the elephant in the room in our farm. We, you know, ignore it at our peril. And we've learned over the years that, um, it can be extremely unpredictable and, we're in kind of a vulnerable situation because, South Fork starts, near Highway 69. Um, just to help locate, we're just south of US 20 and about 14 miles east of 35. And so, Highway 69 is west of 35. Um, the upper part of the headlands or of the watershed starts up there and it eventually reaches the Iowa River, in the thriving metropolis of Gifford, south of Eldora. So we're about halfway down. That probably means that there's 75 to 80,000 acres above us. It's all heavily tiled and, has, a high concentration of hog confinements, which means that, it's all a lot of that land is continuous corn. So, we're in a situation where, not only do we get water from upstream, being as we farm along both sides, that means we have to take the water that comes, out of the hills and from the land, both to the north and the south, whether it's our land or somebody else's land. Law says we have to take other people's water, and so we have to have, because we're closest to the stream, that water all has to come across us, whether on surface or in tile, which all kind of lays a little of the framework to start talking about the wetland. Basically, when Dad bought the property on the north side of South Fork, there was a old building site north, just on the north edge of where our wetland is today. All that really remained was a grove of old soft maples and some stones that outlined where the buildings had been. And of course, Dad had it cleared, but I remember at the time that we got it, that there was open water in the spring in a small area in kind of a marsh or a little boggy area to the south of that old farmstead. Fast forward a number of years, my wife and I, and sometimes visitors would like to go to the area there to see the marsh marigolds in the spring, and it quickly became evident to us that we were where had been that patch of water, we were now walking over a silt fan. And so I spent a number of years checking with NRCS and FSA and anybody else I could think of, looking for any kind of cost share to try and recreate that wetland. And because it had never had any cropping history, none of the programs that were available applied. When we did sign up eventually for a 5-year CSP contract, one of the enhancements we agreed to was to try and recreate that wetland. And basically, 1 year's payment made a down payment on basically digging a hole, and that's essentially what we had to do. Was to excavate enough dirt to try and create a little impoundment for water. And the only other thing we're going to have you take a note of here is before we switch away, you can tell South Fork is considerably south of the area where the wetland is, and the water that leaves our wetland actually winds through the riparian area a fair amount. And so that process had been going along, but we like to think that we may not be making a big impact on South Fork, but at least the water that comes from here, should be somewhat better than if it was being channeled in more directly. There are 2 tile at the north end of this area that do drain into it, but we are essentially, when you see open water, that means that's where the water table is, and so this is a very low area, and that's why it's remained kind of a prairie marsh remnant. Let's go ahead to some of the pictures here as I continue to talk. This is the wetland today. The big thing we were trying to rewind nature on was the invasive reed canary grass, and that's a lot of what you see on the backside. And reed canary is very pernicious in that it loves wet ground and forms a real thick mat, and it has a number of advantages, but when you're trying to maintain a prairie marsh, it's not exactly the most desirable. Unfortunately, it's not always the most appealing for livestock feed either, although there is a lot of volume it apparently isn't the most tasty. It does provide an awful lot of habitat, particularly for, birds and deer and that sort of thing. The one problem we have, we need to burn this area just to push back some of the woody vegetation. Our preference is to burn in the fall, because that's better for the forbs and the flowers. But we've had so many dry falls that it's just never been safe to do it, and it seems like we're always too busy to get it done in the spring. So that's on the list of things we need to do at some point in the future. Over the years, you can go ahead and keep switching through some of the slides here if we can. I think you got the video up, Mike. Let's go to some of the other pictures here. We'll come back to that. Over the years, I've kind of come to understand that, farming is an ecosystem, and it's a group of systems that kind of work together, and I think it's a good analogy to compare a farm ecosystem to a human body. We all know that there's a number of different functions in our bodies that serve different purposes, but they all work together. The one thing that we do know that is any one of those systems isn't up to snuff, we either don't feel good, or we be classified as diseased or sick, or in certain cases it can be terminal. And a farm ecosystem is very similar, and we can look at a human cell and say we've all seen pictures and drawings, we have an understanding how it works, but very few of us have ever actually seen an individual cell, with our eyes. And the same thing can be said about, soil the microbiology in the soil. We know how it works. Very few of us have ever seen very much of it. But we know when it's, when it's more healthy or less healthy. And so really, when we come to talking about wetlands, we're talking about the hydration system, the hydrology, about biology, talking about a lot of different systems that all work together. You can go ahead and keep changing slides there, Mike. Here, my wife likes to take pictures of the wildflowers. So the one thing that is different, and wetlands have been compared to the kidneys, in terms of their function of trying to clean the water. The big difference is that, in the body, the kidneys are actually, cleaning toxins and coming so they can leave the body and not make it sick. And in a farm ecosystem, those toxins that would be comparable are actually nutrients, and done properly, those nutrients should not be leaving the farm ecosystem. And so one of the things that we don't very often understand about with wetlands is that they don't that they clean the water, but they're also a venue or an avenue to try and return some of those nutrients, back into the ecosystem. And that's where a lot of the wildlife comes in. The vegetation provides habitat, provides feed, provides food. When we visit the wetland, go ahead and keep changing, Mike. Here's a cameraman from Iowa Public Television when they were doing a shoot for Market to Market, trying to take pictures of the marsh marigolds this spring. But the reality is we have um, an ecosystem that develops around this wetland that most of us, only see bits and pieces of. You see the birds, you can see some of um, the deer and occasionally muskrats and a variety of those things. But there's also an awful lot of micro biology involved, a lot of water critters. I've tried a number of times to sneak up enough to get a picture of the heron or blue heron that likes to feed in the wetland, but he always hears me coming and flies off before I get close enough. But someday we'll get a picture of him. But that's just an example of and so as they eat and move away from the wetland, they're moving nutrients out of the wetland back onto the landscape, and I think that's an important part of the wetlands that too often gets overseen. I'm going to kind of wrap up with just the observation that we like to all think that farms are places of life, but yet modern farming uses a lot of what could only be classified as poisons, things that will kill a variety of different kinds of life. Well, herbicides that will kill plants, you've got insecticides that'll kill bugs, you got fungicides that'll kill fungal organisms. So we have a lot of things in farming that are really designed to control life or to kill certain things. And so one of the things that always strikes me when I visit the wetland is just the incredible amount of life that appears to be happening at the in this little patch of water. I'd like to share a quote from Lyndon Johnson when he said, once our natural splendor is destroyed, it can never be recaptured. And once man no longer walk with beauty or wonder at nature, his spirit will wither and his sustenance be wasted. And I think that there's a lot of other people who have written eloquently about the importance of nature and about the importance of green spaces, and the importance of having a connection to what is real. And I think in an era when we've got not only virtual this and virtual that and virtual just about everything, we now also have fake virtuality. Being able to be able to see, to be able to smell, to be able to hear, things that are real, I think is really critical. Mike has got a video, and if we've got it figured out, we'll share that to be able to share a little bit of the sound, because one of the things that I'm always impressed with when I go to visit is the sounds of life. And so go ahead and run that, Mike. My apologies for, my limitations and in my videography and stuff. But, that's just a little snippet. And I'm just gonna wrap up by saying, we need to see this conversation in terms of its, place in the bigger, situation that we face in Iowa today. When we hear about, Des Moines can't water their lawns because there's, too much, they can't clean the nitrates, and we know if Des Moines having trouble, there's lots of other towns that are probably, in worse shape. Um, we've got a cancer epidemic. You know, we're facing down the barrel of, a large, wealthy multinational corporation who is trying to, get a license to poison us. And at the present time, Bear's trying to get to the Supreme Court, and they're trying to get their immunity bill and the farm bill. We have, a never-ending stream of stories about forever chemicals and about microplastics, and we have a political landscape that, can charitably be classified as a dumpster fire. So, all of these discussions need to be kind of, in my estimation, need to be kind of couched in, with all those issues in the background. So thank you very much. I hope our comments here have been helpful, and we'll certainly try and answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, John and Mike. It was a really helpful overview of the Swampbuster case, and then also John for presenting why it's important that we maintain these wetlands, especially in our landscape in Iowa, and especially after that video, John, now I just want to spend the whole afternoon outside by a wetland.
You're always welcome.
We do have a question that I will send on over to John here. If the rest of you who are on our call today want to type in any of your questions in the Q&A, I'm happy to send those over to John and Mike. This first one is for you, John. Have you explored the use of beavers to assist in riparian repair and silt capture in the wetland?
Well, we have beavers. Beavers are one of those things that are wonderful, but they're a little hard to control. A beaver wants to do what a beaver wants to do, and we have every year, probably for the past 25 or 30 years, someplace one or two, dams being built on South Fork. What I'm told by people who, study beavers and work with beavers more, they tend to, be family oriented, and at a certain stage, the parents will kick the young ones out, and the young ones have to go, make their own ways. And a lot of times the parents or the older colonies will stay on some of the smaller streams, and I'm told that if we're seeing them in, trying to dam South Fork, which really is a small river, that it's probably an indication that they're, young ones, and a lot of times they will get a dam that will hold through the winter, but probably, once we start getting much flow in the spring, usually don't hold. We do also have, on South Fork, we do have, some otters and, a variety of other wildlife. But the beaver are here. The wetland just does not have enough woody vegetation handy enough, and the stream tends to be a little more attractive that way. I know Fish and Wildlife is currently working, this is an irony that, will always make you smile. Trying to reintroduce beaver onto Beaver Creek, which is a tributary of the South Fork, down closer to Eldora, probably in an area north of New Providence. So that's an effort that has been ongoing for several years to try and and there again, the Beaver Creek is a smaller stream, and so they would probably have a better chance.
John? You kind of alluded to it earlier in your talk too, but I'm curious as to programs that you're aware of to support wetland restoration.
Oh, my apologies. That was on my list, and I said I'd get to it later, and I didn't. At the present time, there are no, well, put it this way. The federal dollars that may have been available, I don't think, really should be, or really are anymore, because as near as I can tell from reports I've seen, this administration's pulled between 50 and $100 million out of conservation in Iowa. And so that's a big hole. The state of Iowa has their water quality initiative dollars, and they're putting a lot of those into their edge of field campaigns, which are designed to put in saturated buffers, bioreactors, and wetlands. Now, I am not familiar with how many actual wetlands have been built. There have been a number of oxbow restorations, which are quasi-wetlands, but are actually somewhat different, in their design, in that they've taken an old stream channel that has been cut off and excavating so that the stream hydrology continues to work in that oxbow. But there are dollars supposed to be available under that water quality initiative. The one requirement that I do know, or that I have heard, is that there has to be tile draining into it. So that's the one thing that I am aware of. I believe you have to have some sort of tile draining into it to be able to qualify. The other thing that's been a problem with some of those water quality initiative dollars is that they've targeted them to certain watersheds, and so I can't guarantee that they're available across the state, but theoretically they should be, and that would be an issue to take up with, certainly to check with your NRCS folks and your IDALS folks, and certainly with your state legislators.
John, I think we can all agree that, especially according to those maps that Mike showed earlier in our presentation here today, that it would be very important for the state of Iowa in order to re-implement some of those wetlands that we have lost over time.
I think it's really kind of fascinating, the history and the story of how basically pretty much with all private money and a lot of private labor, the state of Iowa, lowered its water table 4 feet. And that's really how we have to see what has happened. When Europeans first came to this area, or this part of the state, there were areas that got written off. Well, there's no point even going any further because it's all swamp. You can't go any place. And a lot of our streams, quite frankly, were interconnected bogs. That they probably only really flowed during certain times in the spring or heavy flow. And so this was a landscape that was designed to hold water. It was supposed to sit there and not really move. And so we've essentially with a lot of backbreaking, digging by hand, a lot of this ground was actually drained enough to farm. And the big problem is today, it's not uncommon for, thousands of miles per county of new tile to be installed every fall.
Yeah, we've also heard of some situations where draining of wetlands have affected public water supplies as well. So I'd encourage you all attending this webinar to stay tuned. The Iowa Environmental Council is hoping to bring you some of those stories later on this summer and early into fall. I think that concludes the questions section today. And I see we're close on time too. So I'd like to thank you once again, all of you, for attending the webinar today. Thanks to our speakers, Mike Schmidt and John Gilbert, for your background information on wetlands and why they're important. So I hope you all have a great week. Thanks for attending. Check in with IEC for more webinars this